Well, hello everybody. It's June 2nd and it's Gay Pride Month, and we're here at the Silver Lake Library, and we're interviewing Walt Senterfitt as part of the library's program of Gay Pride Month. And I'm not going to introduce Walt, I'm just going to let Walt introduce himself by asking Walt, would you tell us, first of all, where were you born? A little bit about that part of the introductory stuff. Where were you born, Walt?
I was born on a Marine Corps base in North Carolina, Camp Lejeune, during World War II, and grew up mostly in the South in North Carolina, Tennessee, and North Florida.
Okay.
And tried from the time I was about 12 to figure out how to get out of the South, thinking that would lead to liberation and Edenic living. And so I skipped the senior year of high school and went away to New England to college, and then discovered, I guess prejudice and narrow-mindedness and bigotry is not a Southern monopoly. It just has a different accent up here. And that sort of led me to begin to explore the world on a little bit larger terms, like try to figure out how things put together, and how me, as a young queer boy who didn't know he was queer yet, could find a place in the world, as well as someone who, from the beginning, asked why things were run in a way that was different from the values we were being taught. For example, I grew up in the era of Jim Crow de jure legal segregation. I lived in towns that were about half black, but all the white kids lived on one side of town, went to one kind of school, stayed in segregated waiting rooms, bathrooms, water fountains, the whole bit. And I said, but wait a minute, you teach us that we're equality based society, that our religions value everybody equally. Why don't you run the society that way? And at first they said, you don't understand. And I said, well, I'm a smart kid. I might also have added a smart ass kid. Why don't you explain it to me? And then they just said, well, just shut up, because that's the way things are. So from that age, I guess that was when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I started acting up that way. I've always been trying to figure out why the world isn't more just and what we can do to make it more just. So I went through first the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and then civil rights more broadly, Black-led civil rights movement from the North. Went back then as a Northern college student to work in voter registration and the civil rights in the 60s. Gradually then that expanded to being involved in anti-Vietnam War, in women's liberation, in then later gay liberation, and in becoming an active and committed socialist, union organizer, and along the way have had a number of different career paths. Was first a community organizer, then a school teacher, then I went to nursing school and became a nurse, and a healthcare union organizer, and eventually full-time political activist and organizer. Then kind of took a deep breath, went back to graduate school, came back to UCLA for my PhD in my 40s and 50s in epidemiology and public health, and have worked for the last 20 years for the LA County Department of Public Health as an epidemiologist and as a health ethicist. But at the same time, I've always been involved in movements outside of my job for social justice, and that has involved gay liberation, gay rights, AIDS and HIV, and then more broadly and currently focusing on housing justice and housing crisis and poverty and the things related to that, like ending mass incarceration. So I was just telling Mark that the kind of streams that maybe are relevant to this topic that come out in my life are in different parts that I have concentrated on in some extent. One has been the gay liberation movement, and having always been on the side of it that was more radical, not just the assimilationist, we're like everybody else except that we're gay, just give us our rights, but also the part that says, well, we actually are kind of different as well as the same, and we want to be able to help transform the whole society, not just fit into it as it is. And we're not only gay, we're also, say, women or people of color or handicapped or various other kinds of conditions at the same time. So it doesn't matter if you have the legal right to equality as a gay or lesbian or trans person if you don't have enough to eat, if you're living on the street, if you can't get health care, so that we can't fight for just one thing without fighting for all parts of us as a human being. So that's why I was a part of something that was, I saw in a little ad when I was in Washington, D.C. in nursing school that said, "Gay liberation through socialist revolution. Join the Lavender and Red Union." I said, oh, that sounds interesting. So I wrote to them, and it was organized by Chris Brownlee and Michael Weinstein and Gene Schaffner and a couple of other people.
Do people know who those names? Are you familiar with them? They're kind of extraordinary. Would you talk a little bit about Chris Brownlee and those people in Red Lavender?
Lavender and Red Union. So, yeah, I mean, they were people like me, only I was in Washington, who were politically activist and radical at the time, maybe in the Vietnam War movement and women's liberation, but who also had come out as gay or lesbian, and yet wanted to figure out how can we be radical and openly gay and fight for gay liberation as well as socialist revolution or women's liberation or wherever else it was. So Chris Brownlee, became an activist, writer, columnist locally, and as well as an organizer. Michael Weinstein, who people probably, many of them know, and then later, after this period, went on to found first what was called AIDS Hospice Foundation, and then it became AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Gene Schaffner was an actor who was one of the other co-founders. He ended up kind of dropping out of politics, moving to Hawaii, and just being an actor on the beaches and a surfer for the rest of the time. But I was eager, so I came out here and I invited Michael to come give a talk in Washington, D.C., and because we were also not exactly welcome in the radical socialist movement either, by and large.
Because
they had both the general American society's prejudice against gay people, plus the traditional Stalinist Soviet Union and Chinese society's prejudice against queerness and homosexuality. So we had to fight to be accepted, and we also had to fight within the gay movement to be a valid part of it. And of course, we were putting pressure on people saying, like, you can't run an equitable gay bar and expect us to support you if you also have a quota on admitting black people or Latino people, or you won't let women into your establishment.
And that was the case.
And that was actually the case. Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened in D.C. where I was organizing in parallel. Black people would get triple carded, or there would be a quota after there was 10 or 15% black people in the bar. Then they would start just not letting anybody else in. Same happened here, the Studio One.
Open-toed shoes for women, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we were fighting against these things, and we were raising radical demands in gay pride, but we're about as welcome as a skunk in a garden party. And the same in the gay, but so ultimately we ended up, I mean, we did, I think, make a lot of stink, and then different people, and we had allies, and people went on to express things in different ways. Some people went on to become like radical fairies, went to that kind of continued the cultural liberation stream. Some people went on to become radical lesbian feminists in particular ways. Some of us went on then to find the best part of the socialist communist movement we came and sort of merge into that, sort of saying, that's our bigger struggle, but we're not going to fight for it if it's not for all of us. And so made a difference in terms of, I think, expanding and opening up the left to ultimately fairly fully embracing queer equality and rights as a part of it. So that was the first time I lived in Silver Lake. This was in the 70s.
Where were you living? Do you recall?
I was living down I don't know, it's almost like East Hollywood. It's like it was on La Mirada Street, kind of close to Virgil and that area.
Not far from here.
Yeah, close to here. But another thing that I was involved in at the same time was as a union organizer of nurses and organizing at Kaiser, where that was my first job after nursing school. When I came back out here, I said, well, where am I going to be a nurse? I think I'll go to LA so I can join this Lavender and Red Union. They sound like one of the most exciting bunch of queer radicals in the country that I'd heard of. So I came out here to join them. And we were also, some of us were working as telephone workers in the Communication Workers Union. Some of us were in healthcare. Some of us were in just regular other jobs, but doing kind of the usual leftist agitation and writing newspapers and selling them and going to intervene in meetings and raising our demands. But I was working to organize the RNs, and we organized the RNs. But one of the things that I brought this one as a socialist, communist, queer radical from the Lavender and Red Union into the nurses union at Kaiser Sunset, right in this neighborhood. The idea that we're not just organizing the RNs, who are a relatively privileged part of the healthcare workforce, but we want to be in solidarity also with the janitors, the housekeepers, the kitchen workers, and so they were going to be on strike. So then there was a debate within the RN union: should we honor their picket lines, or should we just keep on doing our job because we're professionals and we've got to put the patients first? I said, well, look, obviously we've got to put the patients first, but the best way to put the patients first is to have absolute solidarity of all of us workers and tell Kaiser, if you settle the strike, then no patient gets hurt. And we will make it easier for you to settle the strike because we, the RNs, are not going to cross the picket lines of the LVNs and the cafeteria workers and the housekeeping workers. And it was a struggle, but I got the majority of the RN union to agree to not cross the picket lines of the so-called non-professional workers. And Kaiser settled the strike they settled without a strike the next day because they saw that it was going to be very complicated. They would have to move patients to other hospitals across town. So, and in the course of that, people started wanting to know, well, what's going on? How did you pull that off? How did you do that? And I said, well, first of all, it's because I really believe in the idea that an injury to one is an injury to all, that a picket line means don't cross, that we have to have solidarity in order to win things. But I think it was the struggle of coming out as a gay man, of coming out with a holistic view of struggle for social justice that helped in making that case and in letting people know that, I had, at that time, this was 76, something still relatively to lose. It wasn't so common to be out and open in the workplace.
It's just 7 years after Stonewall.
Yeah.
Really.
But so that was kind of like the second stream that I think is that I have been an active or out gay man, queer person, LGBT person in a variety of other movements. Not sort of always wearing my, I wear my rainbow suspenders every day now, not always waving my rainbow flag, because at times, my attitude was that you don't have to put this issue first all the time, but you can't ever forget it or put us under the table or back in the closet.
I have never been at an event where Walt hasn't been wearing those rainbow suspenders. They are his trademark, I should say, by the way.
So, and I think that's kind of like the spirit that we brought to the tenants union. I mean, with it, we at Rodney Drive, in our building where we got evicted, 3/4 of us were queer. And that wasn't the main thing. I mean, the main point of unity is that we were tenants getting evicted. But we had a certain solidarity and connectedness and comfort with each other. And also we had, not just me, but Mark and Roberta, other people had a history of other struggles. So that we said, it's also not just about us. We want to immediately start trying to reach out to other people in the same boat, some people who have fewer resources than we do. And we would like to not just fight for ourselves, but help organize other people together. So we have organized this Los Angeles Tenants Union together with people in a bunch of other parts of the city to try to build some tenant power, renters power, collectively, because we're 63% of the residents of the city of LA, but probably have about 5% of the political power. And we don't have the lobbyists, we don't have the money to buy politicians with our contributions or lobbyists to be there at every meeting. We got to work, we got to do other things, take care of ourselves. But I think that we have that sense that solidarity and fighting together is the only way that we will ultimately not only support ourselves and people like us, but build the power to collectively change what's politically possible. People always say, well, what you're talking about is unrealistic. Well, I said, then let's figure out what we have to do to make it realistic. Or it ought not to be unrealistic to kick people out of their houses, but you're saying it's realistic to kick people out of their houses or to make rents unsustainable or to chase people to Lancaster or to Timbuktu, but it's not realistic to actually demand the human right to housing as a reality on the ground? Well, then why not? Let's make it realistic, damn it. And once again, there are a lot of us in this movement, this housing justice movement, that are queer, but sometimes it's relevant to talk about that, sometimes it's not, but we're always there. People know we're there. And I think and we make sure that the movement is trans-friendly and open, for example, is queer-friendly like it is for every other part of it as best we can.
Again and again at the tenants union meetings, which as Walter said, I'm a member of as well, you often bring up the model of ACT UP and your ACT UP work. And could you talk about that a little?
Yeah. So that's the third thing I told them I want to talk about. It's queer activism. It's AIDS activism. And ACT UP. And actually, I was in two parts of the AIDS activist movement. On the one hand, ACT UP, fight back, a diverse, nonpartisan coalition united in anger to demand an end to the AIDS crisis. And was part of ACT UP LA, ACT UP nationally. My particular part, I was on the treatment and data committee, the kind of science geeks in ACT UP to follow the research, to make it explicable and understandable to people who were lay people or who were desperately needing breakthroughs, to also articulate demands on the scientists that we wanted faster development, faster treatment, faster access to clinical trials, to drugs, even if they were not fully approved. But if people were desperate, we wanted to be able to decide what we put into our bodies. We wanted to make access equal for women, for young people, for people with other coexisting conditions. The whole movement of ACT UP, which in turn built on earlier queer liberation, on women's liberation, on the civil rights movement. And I think the fact that a lot of us brought that to ACT UP, brought that kind of rich sense of direct action, of willingness to be in the streets, of a knowledge about how you've got to work with the media, but also not just talk to the media, talk through the media to the country at large and to politicians. And I think a lot of us, and I was, once again, there were some people who were very narrow, there were some others who were very broad, that sort of say all of us or none. We've got to fight not just for these treatments for the upper middle class white gay men, but we've got to fight for access to them for everybody, for people, whatever their gender, whatever their orientation, whether or not they used injecting drugs or whatever else, whether they were incarcerated. And then the other part of the movement that I was involved in, and this was rooted in Silver Lake, was Being Alive, which was also known as the PWA coalitions. It was the People with AIDS Coalition, Action Coalition of Los Angeles, which was founded basically as a self-help organization. When we didn't have help, we didn't have answers, we didn't have people who were taking care of us or getting money, we took care of each other. And at the beginning, a lot of it was just socializing, just companionship, just a place to go to watch soap operas or to hang out with each other, so that you're not just in this devastating, scary isolation, facing death and disability all by yourself.
And what years? What years was this?
Well, this was in throughout the 1980s. I mean, Being Alive was founded in '86. I moved here to get my doctorate at UCLA in '89. I had a partner who was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who had no way to get health care except through clinical trials. He spoke mostly Spanish, and Being Alive had a Spanish-speaking support group that had as many as 60 people. So I was active throughout the rest of the 80s and all through the 90s in Being Alive. Became the newsletter editor and a writer for the newsletter, and this was a place where people counted on to get information about what was happening in research, what was happening in alternative therapies, what was happening in terms of benefits and rights, how you fought with things, what's happening in psychological support, how do people deal with rejection by their families and not being able to go to their partner's memorial services and all this crap that was going on. But we also then had support groups. Being Alive at one point had 35 different support groups, not only in Silver Lake but around the city. We leased a building. We started out at the corner of Hoover and Santa Monica Boulevard, and then we moved to this building that's now Cliff's Edge Restaurant or something. It was the Jungle.
Right. Well, wasn't it also, first you were above the Veterinarian, weren't you? But where the Intelligentsia coffee shop is, as I recall. Then you moved to Cliff's Edge, I believe.
Well, above
the second floor?
That was, ACT UP was up there.
That wasn't also Being Alive?
I don't know.
Okay.
Not while I was there. We were around we were down across the street from the Eagle
right.
on Santa Monica. But Being Alive was just an amazing place where people found support, for one thing, found information, and found a chance to also do advocacy and fight, because we were the ones living with HIV and had the authority then. ACT UP was a mixture of people living with HIV and very militant activists who weren't, but were supporters. Being Alive was the kind of activated self-help support group. We also did things like we had a Sunday night social that would have as many as 300 or 400 people crowd into that back outdoor patio. We started a pause to pause dating service, personals ads that at one point had as many as 1,100 members, because people were socially isolated, but that doesn't mean our social needs suddenly evaporated when we got this crappy virus. But it was a way for people to break out of isolation. And we had an awful lot of skills, both we and ACT UP. because there were a whole lot of middle-class, professional, trained people who suddenly got hit with this virus and had the skills, also had umbrage and outrage. What do you mean I'm getting chopped down at 36 or 37? What do you mean people aren't jumping in to take care of us like they were for the Legionnaires with Legionnaire's disease and stuff? So there was anger, there was skill, there was experience. Now, something interesting then happened, like when we had finally the treatment revolution in 1996 with the breakthrough of the so-called cocktail protease inhibitor and multi-drug antiviral therapy that gave a lot of people a lease on life, including some people the Lazarus effect, getting up from that 1 foot in the grave and 1 foot on the banana peel to be able to actually look like there was a life again. As I used to joke with people, like, later, I'd say, oh, here I was burning myself out as an activist and neglecting finishing my PhD because I thought I was going to die at any minute, and so I might as well just flame out in a burst of activist fury and glory. And then they developed these treatments, and I said, oh shit, now I've got to go back and figure out how to pay off my credit card debts and and finish my PhD. Think about retirement. I didn't know retirement was something that wasn't in my, worldview. But so it was a happy kind of a problem, although not an inconsequential one. But among other things, what happened was that all of a sudden that pipeline of people that were getting the virus, and then maybe they pretend they didn't have it for a while, but then they couldn't anymore. Some of them would be looking ahead. They said, well, I better go get involved in ACT UP and go get involved in being alive because I'm going to need it one day, or I'm pissed and I want to do something now. And these people look like they know what they're doing. So we always had this stream, and then of course we had a lot of other people who had other kinds of problems and maybe weren't dealing with life so well. They had a bunch of extra burdens in addition to this. They needed basic help with dealing with mental health, with substance use, with survival from day to day. But gradually, when the treatment effect came, the people who had the skills and the upper middle class background and jobs stopped coming because they didn't have to anymore. Because they could go ahead and live, a more or less ordinary life with more or less unlimited life expectancy, and more power to them, because that's what we were fighting for. That was a victory. What we had to do, of course, was to fight to make sure that that was open to everybody, not just to people who got dealt the high cards in life, but to everybody. But then the people that kept coming to being alive were the people who needed the help the most. So then there began to be a transition over time, and also related to that was the fact that we got government funding, the Ryan White Care Act. So then there were all these organizations that suddenly had funded, were no longer needing to be just volunteer funding, the APLAs, the centers, and so forth. But they had grants, there was a county bureaucracy, and they would hire people who had been living with this and had experience. But on the other hand, they gradually became more bureaucratized and less of that kind of passionate grassroots volunteer energy. I think that's something that happens. I don't have a real solution to offer to that, because that's something that happens when we win some partial victories in general in social justice, and then some people say, okay, well, that's taken care of. We elected Obama. Racism must be no longer a problem or whatever. But for certain people, things have gotten better. But I think for some of us, and the fact that people are continuing to die, continuing to get HIV, the fact that it is young African American and Latino men who have sex with men and trans women who are disproportionately impacted, but also poorer white kids and women, particularly Black and Latino, that are continuing to get infected, affected, and it intersects often homophobia, transphobia, the fact that there's a whole part of our society that, despite all our progress, are still facing pretty oppressed living conditions, and not supportive families, or not having been given the chance to develop the supportive skills and the opportunities to employ them, that show that the work's not done. And I think shows that we have to fight for liberation across the board in all of the ways in which the human spirit and our human bodies are oppressed. So that's my story in a nutshell. But now
That's what you think. No,
but I'd be glad to talk.
well, I would like to hear you talk a little bit about the work you actually do, which is so impressive and which remains so connected to all that you've been talking about. So what is it you do? How do you earn your rent? How do you pay the rent?
Yeah, how do I pay the rent? Yes, now I'm paying a much higher rent, unfortunately, since we got evicted. Right? I work as an epidemiologist for the LA County Department of Public Health, meaning that we sort of track and monitor the diseases, health conditions, injuries that impact populations and different parts of populations in LA, and what works in terms of preventions and what works in terms of what doesn't work. My specific job is also as an ethicist is to run something called the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, that makes sure that all public health research done in LA County is done ethically with the full information to the people participating and the opportunity for them to consent or not to consent in it. And we kind of, and this is something that I've kind of done, take the traditional individualistic approach to protecting research subjects' rights, which is important, but in my view doesn't go far enough. We also need to look at the community aspect. How does it affect a community? Are these questions that are important, or are they just merely being done to satisfy somebody's need for more publication? How are they going to use this research or evaluative findings for the benefit of the community? And we don't approve things that don't have a plan that includes community participation and community involvement in benefit and dissemination of the results. A second part of my job is that I kind of tie some of the things like the work on housing and homelessness is I work on getting the health department to look more upstream at the causes of health problems in terms of poverty, mass incarceration, discrimination and prejudice and bias, homelessness or housing burden. It's called the social determinants of health. That in fact, this is something people don't know, our health care is only about 10 or 15%, our health is only about 10 or 15% determined by how good our health care is. It's about 50% determined by income, by whether we have housing, by whether or not we live in discriminatory and prejudicial communities and things like this. And then about 10% by the environment and the other 30% about our health behaviors, but most of those are in turn affected, and our ability to change or modify them are affected by those larger social conditions. So we call this a social determinants of health or health equity approach. So I'm kind of an internal agitator in the health department for turning more attention to these upstream determinants or social determinants of health, and getting, for example, the health department to focus on homelessness and on housing this year as one of the things, getting them to spend some of the health dollars on housing people who are chronically homeless as a much better investment than continuing to deal with people going to the ER when what they need is a place to live. So that's how I make my living.
Well, Cheryl has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going back to Silver Lake and the period when the AIDS epidemic was really raging.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember any Silver Lake businesses or churches or organizations that were particularly supportive or welcoming to people with AIDS? No.
There were, I'm sure. I just don't. I mean, in
Like the
particular, I
Crest
mean,
coffee shop or-
yeah. I remember the Crest was where we would hang out there a lot. And in the earlier days, the bookstore, where you,
Oh, a different light.
different light. Those little peaked buildings.
All gone now, I should say. Both
Yeah.
the Crest, certainly those two places.
Yeah, I remember the. What was that bar that's now the Black Cat again? But
Oh, it was called Basco's?
Bosco's, and then it was Le Barcito.
Barcito.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw a Sister Act, and I saw there was this. I said, "That's Bosco's." What do you mean? But I mean, that was a place where people would hang out.
Do you think being alive had a center here in Silver Lake because Silver Lake was...
Yeah, I mean, Silver Lake was one of the key geographic centers of the gay male and secondary extent lesbian communities, and we had a lot of our members lived here, and you know this in West Hollywood, and I think in some ways it was even more heavily hit earlier, particularly because there was a intersection with the leather community more likely over here, which was a place where the virus, for various reasons, sped faster first earlier. But also it was a place, and I remember this going to like the early Sunset Junctions, it was a place where there was more variety and comfort, particularly if you were a person of color and queer, than in West Hollywood, or if you were older. I still don't feel real comfortable in West Hollywood, I must say. But I always feel like I'm invisible over there. But maybe it's changed a lot now. But in Silver Lake, I always felt more comfortable, and I feel a lot of other people felt that way. Yes.
Well, we were talking about impacts to business. I lost 3 tenants to AIDS in the 80s, and I was just wondering if they used to call Silver Lake the blue collar community and West Hollywood the white collar.
Right.
Is Silver Lake becoming more of the white collar, and is the blue collar going somewhere else?
Well, that's certainly true that people are being forced and out of working class and poorer people have been forced out of Echo Park, Silver Lake, very increasingly over the last few years, and that's certainly the case. And you see this kind of gentrification development, the use of the Ellis Act to get rid of long-term rent-stabilized tenancies, like happened to us. Silver Lake and Echo Park have been 2 of the hot spots for that happening, and so clearly, yes, in terms of where else people go, I mean, in the immediate sense, first people went south, like the historic Filipino town and in Koreatown, and maybe further south, and then somewhat further west into East Hollywood. But those areas are also next in line.
What do you think of the Mississippi, Georgia situation, and where's that going to go in the future as far as...
In what sense?
Bathrooms, the
The
transgender.
transgender banning of...
Oh, well, it's clear that the the bathroom thing and the anti-trans phobia and prejudice is the area that the right wing, both cultural and political and religious right, has hit on as the point of backlash. And I'm afraid of it because some of those people are quite determined in their meanness. But like I said, those are my people where I grew up and got away from and a lot. But on the other hand, I've sort of been encouraged that there's been as much blowback and countering of those forces from among white and black and more recently Latino populations. And businesses, yeah, particularly the businesses they sort of see. I mean, that's like what happened with racism in the South in the first place. It was the businesses that, particularly businesses that were national or needed to relate to a national market, they said, wait, we don't, this segregation is bad for business. And this reputation and boycotting and bad press is bad for business. I think obviously in North Carolina and in Georgia, that's happened. But like I have a brother who retired from the practice of the law in Atlanta up to North Georgia Hills. A bunch of other people from Atlanta have retired up there too, in the sort of foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And they've had a place, and I saw it was a YouTube video of a dispute going on in the school about that, the bathroom policy change. And the prejudice didn't surprise me so much because I expected that. What surprised me is that there was maybe a quarter or a third of that audience who stood up and fought back and argued back with these people. So I guess on that basis, my hunch would be that the setbacks are, I'm being a little bit optimistic here, but they're likely to be temporary, but they're very real, particularly for the people who get caught in it right now and have to live with, and particularly as teenagers or younger kids where you don't have so many choices of getting out of a situation or finding ready allies to help you withstand it.
What do you think of the UCLA, somebody, was it Pfizer that withheld the safer drugs for HIV 10 years ago, and it's just now coming out? I don't know if you know anything about that. They actually stopped the trials of the
Gilead. That lawsuit that was, they claim that's not the case, that they just, although their answer is sort of, well, just the people don't understand. This is one of the key antiretroviral treatment drugs is called Truvada, which is a combination of two drugs. And it's made by Gilead Pharmaceutical Sciences. And they make, it's become the single largest best-selling anti-HIV drug. It also has been used it's also used now as a preventive drug for HIV negative, uninfected people. If you take it once a day, it's largely, up to 99% effective in preventing somebody from getting HIV. And that's called PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. But in terms of the treatment, that's where their overwhelming market is. They've made just like buku, almost unconceivable amounts of money off of this Truvada. And it's a good drug. Relatively speaking, it's one of the groups, and it has one of the lower side effects profiles, which was one of the reasons why it was so popular. But they've made like several $1 billion a year pure profit off of this, above their development costs and marketing costs and everything else. But there are some side effects. There are some problems with bone loss, particularly bone, what do you call that?
Deterioration.
Bone density loss, osteoporosis, and some kidney problems. So they have developed a new formulation or modification of the drug that supposedly has fewer of these side effect problems. But they didn't put that into market. They backburnered it until the patent on Truvada was about to start running out. And then when that would be threatened to be available generically at a much lower cost, then suddenly they expedited the development of this improved version of Truvada, so that then they can presumably market it with at full brand name price for another 10 to 17 years. So, and there's a lawsuit about that was on the front page of the LA Times on Sunday. But that's another reason why I'm still a socialist. Because I don't think that a private pharmaceutical company ought to have the right to make those decisions, at least not by itself. To make billions of dollars of profit at a cost of though the cost can be several, of continued having side effects that are preventable by science making a better version of the drug, or by not extending availability of this drug to everybody who needs it, or and why should they be making these god-awful profits anyway? A lot of the research was funded by NIH, by us, the taxpayer, the governments, making the basic scientific discoveries that sometimes even the drug itself, or even if not, even if they had to then take it in a few more stages to make a usable drug, the basic roadmap was laid out for them by government science. And we as activists insisted that that the government science be readily made available, in other words, socialized, but then they privatized the benefits of it. I don't think that's fair.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences with ACTA? I think that's such an interesting, and I would just kind of just a little bit more in depth about what you did, how you were involved, and what was going on,
Right.
Kind of what the temperature was at that time.
Yeah, well, the period was in the mid 80s to the early 90s. It was the period when Ronald Reagan was president, when he couldn't mention the word AIDS until 2/3 of the way through his presidency. They were not responding with large-scale government investment. There were a lot of people, even at the CDC, which I later went to as a visiting scientist from 2000 to 2002, where by then things had changed a lot. Although I was still only one of the few openly, HIV positive people there, but the government scientists, even the friendly ones, were still kind of tittering, talking about gay sex. They didn't much understand how we had sex, and they were embarrassed to talk about it. And but that's pretty damn important when you're trying to figure out how a disease is transmitted and how to prevent it. You need to not be squeamish here. You need to just look for the facts and talk and share openly. So that was kind of the context. Jesse Helms was a leading force in the congressional non-response and even anti-response, and the fear of Jesse Helms, any idea of talking about sex openly, he was determined to make that illegal or cut off your funding. And he would pass these things called the Helms Amendments, even when we started getting some government money that said, you can't do anything that's considered to be promoting homosexuality. And then people said, okay, but then that's singling out gays. He said, okay, why don't we say you can't promote any kind of sex? We call it at first the no promo homo amendment. And then it was later just no sex. Like, no sex, please, we're British or something. It's like, but that was kind of funny. The activists settled for that no sex so that it wouldn't be just no gay sex, but I'm not so sure that was, in retrospect, much of a victory. So that, like, you see the difference between European or Australian HIV prevention and STD prevention materials that's very lush, sensuous, makes you want to look at it, makes you want to put it up on your wall as a reminder. But here, no, that would be violating the Helms Amendment. So that was what was going on. So ACT UP, with the coming out of the early, like I said, pretty much direct descendant civil rights movement, women's movement, and early gay liberation, including gay activists, both GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, and Gay Activist Alliance. Gay Activist Alliance was, in some ways, became later the more sort of single issue gay rights, as opposed to Gay Liberation Front, who was more general, broad human liberation. We can't separate ourselves off from the other struggles. But many of the people in GAA, Gay Activist Alliance, this was New York based, but also had an LA reflection, were very much into militant tactics, even if it was very gay rights specific, of street disruption, street theater, media approaches,
Zaps, media
zaps, thinking, so that pretty much came into ACT UP New York, which then spread particularly through the National Gay Marches on Washington in 87.
87.
That was the one where ACT UP really went from being New York to national, including in LA. And people like Chris Brownlee, like Mark Kostopoulos, and a whole bunch of people who are dead, came and were leaders in early ACT UP. So the kind of fights that we had here were to have a county HIV clinic, which came to be known as 5P21 at LA County USC Medical Center. And then an inpatient AIDS ward. And we would do things like having die-ins, sit-ins, zaps at the Board of Supervisors, outside county health department offices, outside hospitals that were known for not giving sensitive treatment. And I remember one of the controversies was whether you went after your friends as well as your enemies or opponents. ACT UP's tendency was that we need to go to everybody. This is not a time for gradualism. We need action now. So we would go after and target people like Ed Edelman, who was a member of the Board of Supervisors, and Kenny Hahn, who were the two most liberal members of the county, 5-member Board of County Supervisor at the time. And I think by embarrassing them, we got them to move the more conservative ones. But civil disobedience, arrests, we also did political funerals and memorials, like down Santa Monica Boulevard, through WeHo down, and it intersected. I don't know, when I first got to town, there was this AB 101, this gay rights bill that Pete Wilson vetoed. It was the first statewide anti-discrimination bill, and there was a lot of overlap between ACT UP and the militant part of the gay rights, like Queer Nation, and so those were the kinds of struggles. And then some of the times we also we also had clinic defense, abortion clinic defense within ACT UP. We had teams that would go to what was that group called? Operation Rescue. Those people that would to rescue the babies. And ACT UP, we had teams that would go do abortion clinic defense. I remember we'd sometimes getting up at 5:30 in the morning and go down to Orange County or to some place where there was going to be a targeting and an attack. But I think the biggest victories we won here in LA were in getting 5P21 as an HIV clinic, and in getting the dedicated AIDS ward at County Hospital. And then it spread. AHF was organizing as a kind of spin-off of ACT UP. There were other spin-offs, and this happened around the country, but it happened here. Like Housing Works is a spin-off in New York where the Housing Committee of ACT UP then began to fight for housing for people living with HIV or people highly vulnerable. And the slogan was "Shelters kill, but housing works." So then they incorporated it as Housing Works and became a separate organization. Here we also started the Needle Exchange, the Clean Needles Now, CNN, which is now called LA Community Health Project. But that was an ACT UP project, which then spun off to become, and it was a guerrilla operation at first. It was not legal to do needle and syringe exchange. And so that was part of the spirit of ACT UP, was regardless of whether something is legal, it needs to be done, and so we'll do it as a guerrilla operation. Yeah.
What happened to the protesters of the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Where are they now?
Well, some of them are still here, like me.
But why aren't the millennials? Are they just apathetic, or is it just they're too busy trying to survive, or what's the deal?
I don't know. I'm kind of probably not the best one to ask or to speculate about that. Sometimes I get frustrated, but I'm also been excited that there's some people like coming to the tenants union, people who are artists or art students or students who are being moved by the homelessness and by the housing crisis. There are some people, particularly global AIDS activists in a group called like Health Gap is the name of one of them. There was another spin-off from ACT UP, who fighting for funding for AIDS prevention and treatment in developing countries and nations, and the fact that the developed nations have an obligation to fight for. That was another fight. The first time I brought that up, a lot of the AIDS activists here, some of the more traditional ones, attacked me. What do you mean? Why do you want to take our money and give it to people in Africa? Or that's unrealistic to think that you would ever get the U.S. government to spend money for trying to end AIDS in South Africa or Thailand or somewhere. But some of the activist tactics, in this case, another kind of tactic that the ACT UP Health Gap used is what we call bird dogging. If you, like in an election campaign, when candidates are running and in the Democratic and Republican primaries, particularly when they're at the primaries, when you're in New Hampshire or Iowa or stuff, and it's all still at the very retail level, you can get access to the candidates. And so if you showed up there when they have a small event and there's 8 or 10 of you with your banners flashing in front of the TV cameras behind them, or asking questions where they can't avoid you and there's a microphone, about why, Mr. Gore, are you supporting Clinton's denial of an exception to the patents of U.S. pharmaceutical companies, because we were demanding for relief from patents to allow for generic production of antiretroviral drugs for use in Africa. And that was one of the shameful things of the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration. But pushing Al Gore at a time when he was vulnerable, when he was running for president, that we got him to agree to change their policies. And so the same kind of thing now. Whenever, particularly in the swing states or when there's close elections, you bird dog the candidates by show up and put them on the spot and demand that they take a stand, to end AIDS or to end queer discrimination or to end homelessness.
One more question, maybe, if anyone has one. One more quick question, or else we'll wrap it up now.
I was also a Jeopardy champ, did you say?
Yes. Tell us about that. Wonderful. This is the cherry on top.
That was fun when I was still at UCLA in my doctorate. This was in '93. I competed. I'd always sort of been fascinated. I said, well, if I ever move to LA, I think I'm going to try that. So I went out there and took the test and got on. And the first year, maybe they didn't take me because I didn't pass the screen test well enough. Because after you pass the SMART test, then they do a screen test kind of thing. But so then they called me back. So then I won 4-day champion, and then came back and was a semifinalist in that year's Tournament of Champions. The funny thing when they were asking me questions, like Alex Trebek was saying, "But well, you're a nurse, Walt. I mean, aren't nurses mostly women?" I started to say, "Alex, I'm queer," but that
Well, thank you, Walt.